Thank you for such a kind and generous introduction, and thanks also to Moshe and Ronnie for the invitation to come to Jerusalem. Ronnie was actually a student in the first graduate seminar I ever taught, and so it's especially nice to visit her in her home institution and see her flourishing. I also want to say thanks to Tylee for her amazing hospitality and help, and also to the wonderful group of graduate students who joined me for lunch today and answered my questions much more than I answered theirs. I learned a lot. It was a great conversation. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak about my new book, which is a history of queer people on the job from the mid-20th century to the present. And is the volume okay in the back? Okay, good. So I'll talk today about why I wrote this book, how I went about it, what I found, what I think the most important interventions are that the book makes, and if I have time, I'll close by reading a brief excerpt to give you more of a sense of it. But before I do any of that, I'll start by doing something that admittedly I almost never do. I'll start by following myself, the advice that I regularly give to graduate students. When you take your work out into the world, I say to them, particularly when interviewing for a job, but really any time, you should try to have at the ready not just the elevator pitch description of your overall project, but really you also need at your fingertips a single anecdote, one brief story that really gets to the heart of what you are up to. Your audience will hopefully remember that anecdote, that one story, long after you are gone. And so my book is full of anecdotes, it's full of stories, but there is one of these nuggets that I think encapsulates the whole better than anything else. And so let me briefly share that with you and ask you to remember it, as I'll come back to it later in the talk. It comes from the very end of the first chapter, a chapter that sets out what I call the straight world of work of the 1950s and 1960s. There, I describe one government economist's experience of learning that her security clearance investigation had revealed her homosexuality, and she was on the brink of being fired from the Treasury Department. Her immediate boss, who was sympathetic to her plight, helped set up an interview for her with some private sector economists whom he knew in New York. She was fortunate that he was willing to help, and also that the New York firm was not looking for someone to do government work. But still, she had a strategy to ensure the needed outcome, and this is critical. She asked her boss to be sure that the prospective employer knew about her clearance problem, meaning about her homosexuality. This was shrewd on her part. For the New York company, the so-called clearance problem was not an impediment. Rather, it was an opportunity to get a highly skilled economist at a significantly reduced price. They knew the only reason they could hire me was because of that clearance, she recalled. For the economist, the job offer came much more quickly than she had expected, and it was, as she described, an end to my desperation. But it was, she also observed, a much lesser job than otherwise I would have taken. So that's your nugget. Please hold on to that as we go along. Now, I wrote this book to address two gaps in the existing historiography. First, the workplace itself is seriously understudied by historians of sexuality, especially when one considers how important work is to the queer past. Not only was fear of job loss probably the greatest fear that queer people had for much of the period that I'm writing about, a fear that very much shaped how queer people moved through the world, but somewhat paradoxically, workplaces sometimes supported queer lives in very particular ways. Gay people found each other on the job, they clustered in certain kinds of work, and some occupations validated the experience of gender nonconformity that was central to at least some queer lives. As one woman who sought mechanical work in the 1950s declared, she always felt happiest when she had a hammer in her hand, or a man who exulted around the same time that he was a typist and he wanted to type. So against a historiography that has disproportionately focused on nightlife and leisure, I thought the workplace might be worth paying more attention to. And I wanted to do it not by considering a single occupation or type of worker, blue collar or white collar, corporate executive or flight attendant, teacher, librarian, or social worker, but rather by trying to paint a broad canvas. And for me, part of that broad canvas, and here we get to the second historiographic lacuna that I wanted this work to fill, part of that broad canvas had to include women, a group that has also been somewhat neglected in the field of LGBT history. And there are a lot of reasons for this neglect, but at least some of it comes down to a source problem. Historians of sexuality have leaned heavily on the archival traces of state policing to document the queer past. These are amazing sources in many ways, but when the state policed sexuality, it was usually policing men. My first book about the state's regulation of homosexuality during the first half of the 20th century is, despite my own deep commitments as a feminist historian, predominantly about male experience for this reason. And so when I started to conceptualize this book, I thought much more deliberately about sites from which to write a queer history that would not marginalize women. And it soon became obvious to me that the workplace could be such a site. After all, lesbian breadwinners needed better, higher paying jobs than married women to survive economically, and they sometimes violated gender norms to obtain them. By necessity, as a team of sociologists concluded in the 1960s, lesbians were seriously committed to work. So those are some of the reasons why I wrote this book, but how did I go about it? I think it was unavoidable that at first my approach was conditioned by the dominant narrative of the lavender scare. To the extent that historians of sexuality had considered gay employment at all, I would say this has been the primary paradigm, even a kind of shorthand for mid-century. The lavender scare, of course, refers to the brutal episode when thousands of gay and lesbian civil servants, including the Economist, with which I began today, were purged from the government. The Economist's surprising survival strategy, a strategy that ultimately involved self-exposure, was not something I knew about when I commenced my research, nor was it represented in the historiography. What was more prevalent was a notion of employers determined to root out the homosexuals on their staffs, and then deep hiding on the job by those employees. And so I began my research assuming that it was likely that gays had tried to vanish on the job, and that digging up the historical evidence could, as a result, be tough going. Determined to try, I began where anyone who was working on the post-war period with little confidence in what the archives might yield would begin, with oral histories. Because I thought the period before gay liberation would be especially difficult to recover, I began to look specifically for gays and lesbians born in the 1930s and 1940s who were willing to speak with me about their experiences on the job. Their working lives, which spanned the 1950s into the 1990s, also mapped temporally onto the rise and fall of standard employment that I also assumed would be central to my story. I conducted my first interviews in 2011, and I ended up doing more than 150 of them. And what jumped out at me during those initial conversations was not something that I had expected to hear. More often than I heard stories about elaborate ruses to conceal sexual identity at work, I heard from informants that they assumed their bosses and coworkers suspected or even knew about them. This degree of visibility and knowability surprised me, and it gave me more confidence to head into the archives. There, I found my lesbian economist who outed herself to private sector employers and many other related scraps of evidence. Together, all of this pointed me toward a reconsideration of the lavender scare as our dominant way of thinking about gay employment in the mid-20th century. And to elaborate, it's not that the lavender scare framework is wrong, it's that it applies to a particularly dramatic flashpoint in a particular sector that doesn't fully capture the experience of many gay people at work, even at mid-century. While fear of job loss was a pervasive anxiety during these years, employees handled that fear in a variety of ways. My research has found that not all gay people, especially those employed in the private sector, were engaged in deep hiding in their jobs at mid-century. First of all, there was a queer work world that overlapped with the secondary labor market populated by women and people of color in low-paid, low-status work, where gay people could be open and where non-normative gender expression was sometimes affirmed on the job. As one informant told me, I was always looking for those low-paying jobs where I could be myself. Many gay people, however, were employed in a straight work world in relatively better jobs, but in positions that did not affirm queerness and often repressed it. In the words of another informant, I couldn't wait to leave the office to be who I was. Yet even there, the spectrum ranged from secrecy to discretion, with many employees engaged in what the sociologist Irving Goffman called covering. Covering implied the work of keeping one's stigma from looming large, but it rarely required an elaborate performance. As it turns out, many employers were happy to look the other way. Employment relations during these years were in fact regularly characterized by an unspoken bargain between employees and employers. This was a mutual pact to neither reveal nor to pry. Now, it's obvious why this arrangement, this bargain, made sense for understandably apprehensive gay employees. But for their employers, why look the other way? The appeal of gay workers at mid-century, I argue, can only be understood in contrast to the other workplace bargain that was struck during these years. This was not the queer bargain, but the straight one that provided male breadwinners with a family wage to support their wives and children in exchange for submission on the job. As many historians have noted, this was an expensive and burdensome arrangement, but in a booming economy, the stability it bought was for a time worth the price. In this context, then, gay workers were especially valued for their precarity in an age of security. The appeal of gay workers at mid-century was that of a vulnerable labor force, one whose consciousness was shaped by the specter of the government purges and who commonly knew of other queer people who had lost jobs. These workers could be underpaid relative to the level of skill and responsibility their jobs demanded, easily pushed out with downturns in the business cycle, and expected to quietly walk away when fired. They would also stay in jobs where they felt safe, even when they were mistreated. Gay people also brought assets to their jobs that employers recognized and cared about. Because they were perceived as unattached from family units, they were contingent, easy to move, and flexibly deployed. As a result, they potentially alleviated some of the pressure of the Fordist breadwinner model at a time when many labor arrangements, as I said, were still expensive, cumbersome, and inflexible. In some, they were harbingers of the post-Fordist transformation of work that was still several decades in the future. As long as gay employees were discreet and they did not attract negative attention, there were many reasons for employers to avoid seeing what they didn't want to see. Now, because queerness, in contrast to race, is transversal to class, meaning that queer people do not occupy a single class position, but are distributed throughout the class structure, it is sometimes assumed that they have experienced cultural animus, but not economic exploitation. My book takes aim at this assumption, arguing, as one social theorist recently put it, that the liabilities of homosexuals are hardwired into relations of production. Those dynamics were in fact explicitly called out by gay liberationists beginning in the early 1970s. Our bosses know we're gay, but pretend not to notice, one liberationist tract explained. For that, we are profoundly grateful, as we are expected to be. As a result, this writer lamented, gays performed work that others would not tolerate. Other liberationists took aim specifically at the way that the criminalization of sexual behavior and gender transgression outside of the workplace licensed queer vulnerability within it. Yet laws against homosexuality, another liberationist noted, did not prevent homosexuals from being hired, nor were they intended to. What they enabled, rather, was the systematic exploitation by employers of state created legal vulnerabilities. And it's important that even tolerant and understanding employers, such as those economists from New York, benefited from the system of gay labor that the liberationist writers described. Now, whatever the attitude of various employers toward their employees, however, the bargain that defined employment relations more broadly did begin to break down in the 1970s and 1980s, as some gay people heeded the liberationist call to reject its terms. And that development was enabled first by a terrible economy in which there was simply less to lose, and then by a deadly epidemic that had the same effect. More and more, gay people yearned not only to be seen, but acknowledged. Outside the workplace, this occurred with alacrity as gay culture exploded across these decades. Inside the workplace, the pace of change was slower. And this had something to do, I argue, with the way that gay people were mostly left out of the civil rights achievements of these years. In contrast to other groups that suffered from discrimination on the job, queer workers gained no underlying blanket protection. In fact, no other minority group has had so little claim on formal legal protection. And that void mattered as employers responded with increasing animus to employees who were tossing away their former norms of discretion. Historians have focused more on the freeing aspect of these years rather than their overall precariousness, but these elements are, to my eye, inextricably intertwined. Yet even outside the regular mechanisms of civil rights laws, workplaces partially opened to gay workers, and clearer expressions of identity gradually became possible by the end of the 20th century. And so how did that happen? One explanation has to do with the distinction between civil rights laws and civil rights culture. The civil rights imaginary increasingly included gay people, in other words, even if civil rights laws did not. Both the African American freedom struggle and the women's liberation movement affected the rights consciousness of many gay people, changing their sense of what they were entitled to in the workplace. And while this growing rights consciousness did not emerge alongside robust legal tools, this study documents the responsiveness of business to demands that queer employees increasingly made for protection and recognition. Business was out ahead of both government and labor unions in protecting and otherwise demonstrating a receptivity to gay workers by the 1990s. I argue in part because of the way these workers were in sync with and even prefigured the employment regime of late capitalism. So just as the historian Sven Beckert recently argued that the emergence of industrial capitalism was built on older social hierarchies, in his case, he's talking about patriarchal relations in the household, a similar claim might be made about the ways in which post-industrialism, or post-Fordism, was built in part on the economic position of queer people at mid-century. Many attributes that later came to be associated with post-Fordism, short-term precarious work arrangements that enabled employers to shed responsibility for family units, were the ones that, going back as far as the 1950s, could also be identified with gay labor. One could, of course, make a similar argument about women and also workers of color. But queer workers were even more predictive because of the way they represented precarity in primary as well as secondary sector jobs, the corporate office as well as the retail shop, and because of their perceived lack of dependence. To be clear, I do not claim that queer people were more precarious than women or people of color, and many were, of course, positioned at the intersection of these identities. The point is rather to highlight the ways that gay workers offered capital a mid-century lesson in structuring employment relations without regard to family attachment, even in primary sector jobs for which the breadwinner caregiver model was paradigmatic, and relatedly, to note that queer people were among the first precarious workers across the class spectrum. For example, in middle-class jobs dominated by white men. In secondary sector employment long associated with contingent and fragile jobs for women, people of color, and immigrant workers, we should only notice that queer people were also present there among the precarious. So having laid all of that out, let me briefly say a bit about what I think the stakes are of a project like this. So first, as I've already suggested, I am interested in revising somewhat the place of the lavender scare in the historiography. But I want to be clear that I'm not rejecting its importance or writing against it. Rather, I'm seeking a way of positioning the lavender scare that does not overgeneralize based on the public sector, but rather relates public and private sector experiences to one another to capture the range of ways that people appeared at work during this period. And again, I return us to the government economist with whom I began, and the way her movement through public and private sectors hints not just at government repression, but a labor system that was built up around it. And this gets me to a related second intervention. I want to invite us to think less about this job or that job, and more about this entire work experience systemically. To think, in other words, about gay labor as a form of labor, something we can talk about in the same systematic way that we might talk about women's work or immigrant labor, for example. And the latter example might be especially revealing, as I see particularly interesting parallels between gay and immigrant labor for at least two reasons. First, both types of workers were sometimes viewed as unencumbered by dependence. With queer people, because whatever the reality of their attachments, they often presented as functionally single at work. And with certain immigrant groups, because families were sometimes left behind in sending countries. Second, and as importantly, for both groups, the potentially illegal status of the workforce shaped working conditions. Gay people shared with certain immigrant populations, in other words, a presumptive status as illegal persons. And this licensed exploitation and otherwise shadowed their movement through the working world. I find it noteworthy that so many of the jobs that were predominantly gay in the pre-liberation era, think of restaurant kitchens, for example, are now often predominantly held by immigrants. This may be a key then to unlocking a mystery, helping us to think systematically about gay work, like immigrant labor, again, as a form of labor. Now, I make that move, I hope, without conflating what are undoubtedly different scales of vulnerability in these communities, but also wanting to be clear about what I see as another key intervention in my work. I am highlighting the long history of queer vulnerability at work and explicitly taking on the myth of gay affluence that has been so distorting. While economists have long debunked the notion of gay affluence, it has been difficult to dislodge in the broader culture. And the cultural hold of this idea, of course, has a history, and at least part of that history is featured in my book. In the midst of the AIDS crisis, after years of getting almost nowhere in advocating for federal protection, some employees in the corporate sector went to their companies to ask for both protection and recognition. Now, it took some concerted work, but the corporate sector was eventually quite receptive, and so the most meaningful version of gay employment rights initially came not through legal mandates, but through the market. This, of course, was patchwork protection, and it left much of the working class as vulnerable as ever. And the result was that by the end of the 20th century, middle class and wealthy gay people were far more likely to be visible in their jobs than working class and poor queers. Not only did this then bolster the appearance of gay affluence, but it is also a striking reversal, I show, from the mid-20th century, when queer people were far more visible in working class occupations than those in most professional settings dared to be. I want to recover then this longer arc of precariousness as really central for thinking about gay experience, as well as to highlight the really particular and interesting way that the gay rights movement has also been, in the American context, the most marketized of all social movements. And then this then gets me to neoliberalism. One of the things that this book undoubtedly shows is that emancipatory things do sometimes come from the market. As a progressive who truly believes in public sector solutions to our collective problems, I am profoundly ambivalent about that. But even with that ambivalence, I think most of the work that I've read that sets out a relationship between gay rights and neoliberalism offers a powerful critique, but is sometimes under-nuanced in its treatment of history. Under-nuanced in that it minimizes how the turn to business in the late 1980s and early 1990s was about the evaporation of other political possibilities on the ground, as well as how vulnerable queer people were in their employment across many different sectors at that moment. But I also think the most important historical question is not why queer people turned to the corporation. It's really why business responded. And I contend the answer has a lot to do, circling back to where I've already been, with the way that the values long associated with queer workers aligned so perfectly with the demands of late capitalism. So those who the social theorist Melinda Cooper once called Fordism's non-normative subjects actually became post-Fordism's normative ones. A position that was once marginal has in some sense become the center. And we should perhaps think of queer workers less as outliers than as harbingers of axial shifts in employment relations across the second half of the 20th century. And I'll mention one last thing. And perhaps this is less an intervention my book makes than simply an aspiration, but the one that I hold most dear. In writing this book, I really wanted to inhabit the space that the discipline of history provides at the intersection of the social sciences and the humanities. I wanted to write a book, in other words, that both offered a structural account of gay workers across changing employment regimes in the post-war United States and an affective labor history that could reveal the workplace as a site where queer people experienced not only great vulnerability, but also the deepest kind of meaning. And I've really given you the structural account in the last 25 minutes. I think the best way to give you a sense of a more affective mode is to read a short excerpt from the book. The excerpt that I've chosen is from the chapter on employment discrimination during the AIDS crisis, which was really dramatic and startling. Even compared to the Lavender Scare, this is, I believe, the historical nadir of gay employment in the United States. But in a chapter focused on job loss, I also wanted not to lose the disease itself. And one way to do that was to focus on the new kinds of work that emerged as a result of the epidemic. One central example was in nursing. And so I start this chapter borrowing from the historian Thomas Adams with what he calls a workscape. And the workscape here is the country's first dedicated AIDS ward at San Francisco General Hospital. And I should also add that I was writing this chapter just as the country was shutting down in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020. And I think the intense gratitude that we all felt to healthcare workers at that moment surely found its way into the structure of feeling in this chapter. And so let me turn to that. The nation's first dedicated AIDS ward was the result of a confluence of two factors: a budget surplus in the city of San Francisco and the dismal treatment that AIDS patients were receiving as they began to fill hospital beds across the city. Many arrived with pneumocystis pneumonia, and hospital staff were shocked when they had to put so many young men on ventilators. There were instances of blatant homophobia. One doctor, for example, who described the bronchoscopy he was about to perform as sticking a tube down this fag's throat. But more often, fear of infection distorted the care that hospital staff were able to give, putting on a spacesuit before entering a patient's room, leaving food on a tray in the hallway, and avoiding interaction with patients. What began as periodic instances of inconvenience and disrespect, two nurses wrote, developed into a widespread breach of quality of care for people with AIDS. In the fall of 1982, a gay nurse named Cliff Morrison voiced his concerns to Marianne McGuire, the director of nursing, when they ran into each other in the hospital cafeteria at San Francisco General Hospital. McGuire raised the idea of an inpatient AIDS unit. Morrison was initially resistant to the idea, as were many others within the gay community, because a separate unit might become something akin to a leper colony. But Morrison soon came around. He himself was about to transfer from psychiatric nursing back to general medical and surgical nursing, and he suggested to McGuire that she make him a clinical coordinator for AIDS care. McGuire took the proposal to hospital administrators, who were relieved to have someone willing to take on the crisis. They were also open to paying for things that in another context would never have flown, especially in a county hospital. Morrison was committed to primary nursing, the idea of an all-RN staff in which a registered nurse provided all the care to a patient. There were no nursing assistants or licensed vocational nurses changing sheets or emptying bedpans. The primary nursing model provided a high quality of care, accountability, and continuity. Nurses would coordinate care and be responsible holistically for the needs of patients. It was very expensive, yet the city said yes. In setting up the ward, Morrison was also able to arrange for a 1-to-4 ratio of nurses to patients, which was almost unheard of. Private rooms for patients were also critical to prevent cross-infection between patients who might have different opportunistic infections. Justified by a critically ill patient population with complex medical and psychosocial needs, the ward was, a nurse later reflected, nursing the way nursing was supposed to be. Remarkably, at a time when no one yet understood how the virus was transmitted, 40 nurses applied for 12 positions on the unit. Morrison looked for a mix of those who had experience in hospice and critical care and those who had experience working in mental health. When McGuire looked at the staff Morrison had selected, she commented that he had chosen all the troublemakers in this system. He replied that he saw the strengths he was looking for. Roughly half were gay men, 1/4 were lesbians, and 1/4 were straight women, some of whom had formative ties to gay men and felt connected to gay culture. Morrison then asked the staff to make key decisions about how the work would be organized. They voted for a schedule, for example, in which 3 intense 12-hour days were followed by 4 days away to rest and recover. Ward 5B opened in July of 1983. Initially, the feeling on the job was oddly celebratory, almost like a party. And for some of the gay nurses, it was the first time they had ever been completely open in their jobs. Hospitals in those days could be hypersexualized, almost incestuous work environments, with young men and women interns, residents, and nurses sharing an experience of trauma and suffering in close physical proximity. But that work culture, whether it was experienced as exciting or exploitative or something in between, tended to be heterosexually charged, which exacerbated the isolation of gay and lesbian nurses. One nurse remembered making up stories about what she did on the weekend when she worked at French Hospital in San Francisco. Another remembered the worry, given the interdependence of nurses, that if people knew you were gay, the other nurses wouldn't be there for you. Others recalled quietly finding other gay nurses to eat lunch with, discreetly forming a secret affinity group. For most nurses, as for most professionals more generally, gay life was kept separate from work, even though the liberationist ethos had begun to erode this boundary. On the AIDS ward, by contrast, your work and your outside life, in the words of one nurse, were all one thing. The culture on the ward was not merely tolerant of gay culture, it celebrated it. One bisexual nurse noted that it was the straight part of her identity that was closeted at work because the norm was so clearly gay. In the early days especially, nurses were incredibly bonded with each other, with an us against the world feeling. Imagine a group of young, mostly gay nurses being left alone by their hospital administration to create something totally unique in the country. There was the electricity of beginning something brand new, one nurse reflected. They were buoyed by the feeling that they were coming together to care for their own community, and by the sense in the early days that AIDS would unfold like Legionnaire's disease and be quickly over. We can lick this thing, was the spirit on the ward. The unique culture of the ward was also shaped by its porousness. It was known as the ward without walls. From the beginning, the staff created policies that invited the community in. They immediately did away with visiting hours. For example, if a partner wanted to spend the night, we rolled in a cot, Nurse Steve Keith remembered, and said, "Come on." Long stays in private rooms meant that many patients made their rooms their own, bringing in crystal flower vases, champagne glasses, musical instruments, and boom boxes to enliven these spaces. At some point, someone donated a piano. The ward also encouraged support from the community more broadly. Some of those arrangements were formal, as with the Shanti Project, a social service organization that had been created in the 1970s to support people with life-threatening illnesses. Shanti counselors were on the ward from the beginning. More informal arrangements also developed over time, and certain individuals became fixtures. Rita Rocket, for example, a travel agent who had a history of partying with gay men before the epidemic, appeared every other Sunday to cater a brunch and tap dance for delighted patients. Cabaret singer Sharon McKnight came to perform Patsy Cline songs. Birthdays, weddings, and baptisms were celebrated on the ward. Even in the midst of the epidemic, there was a brightness to the gay community in the early 1980s, and some of that energy made its way onto the ward. The closest parallel in terms of a communal expression of pride and identity was probably the ethnic hospital of the early 20th century. The communalism of the unit was strengthened as well by the length of time that patients were on the ward. Early in the epidemic, admissions would sometimes last several weeks, and many AIDS patients were readmitted 3 or 4 times over the course of their illness. Because of the length of hospital stays, as well as the low nurse-to-patient ratio, nurses got to know their patients and sometimes formed close relationships with them. I was always a good technical nurse, Susanna Keeley remembered, but the psychosocial aspects of her nursing practice grew and blossomed during her years on the ward. Total involvement with patients was a byproduct not only of a disease that at that point had a nearly 100% mortality rate, but also of the fact that many patients with AIDS lacked traditional support systems. Some were estranged from their families before they ever got sick. Others came out to their families only when forced to do so by their diagnosis. And many feared being rejected at the moment when support was desperately needed. Those layers of vulnerability deepened the bonds that nurses formed with patients, and many of the traditional boundaries between nurses and patients were discarded. Physical touch became a central part of the care work and included nurses crawling into bed to hold distressed patients. Bill Barrick remembered getting in bed to embrace a crying patient and being with him for 5 or 10 minutes when a Shanti volunteer happened to walk by. I had 3 other patients I needed to take care of, and we exchanged hand signals, he remembered. I slipped out and she slipped in. It was incredibly finessed. Nurses also helped patients to navigate complex relationships with families, and they helped support distressed parents and siblings as they were learning all at once that their sons and brothers were gay and in all likelihood would soon be dead. Steve Keith got to know the brother and sister of a patient who had come to San Francisco for the first time and spent 5 days sitting on the ward. He didn't want their whole experience of the city to be a hospital room, and so before their flight, he loaded them in the car and showed them some of the fun parts of the city, describing this as something you wouldn't normally do in a nursing job. As often, though, nurses would need to strike an adversarial tone with families of origin. An RN remembered putting herself physically between a patient's mother and his group of gay friends, whom she tried to order out of her son's room. "No," the nurse said to her, "you don't have the authority to do that." Nurses sometimes protected patients from employers who called the ward looking for their employees. Nurses never gave out the identities of people on the ward for this reason, and the board showing admissions on the ward only used first names. Nurses might also put themselves between patient and doctor, explaining that patients could refuse being poked and prodded when it wasn't going to change the trajectory of their illness. Nurses were more powerful in these contests than otherwise would have been the case, because AIDS was a nurse's disease that inverted the typical relationship between doctors and nurses. We were the experts, not them, Marcy Fraser remembered. We would sit around and look at x-rays with doctors and say, "What is this?" But it was a nurse-run operation. Even when they were allies and partners with nurses, doctors had much less to offer patients suffering with the disease for which there was no treatment. It was the comfort and pain relief that nurses gave that mattered. There was always some risk to the job. Perhaps not as much as nurses off the ward imagined, but perhaps more than the 5B nurses allowed for. Before it was really known that AIDS was not spread by casual contact, nurses on the ward were instinctively headed there. We were basically role modeling one way of relating to patients, Diane Jones remembered, which was to go in without precautions. In part, 5B nurses were reacting against what they viewed as the hysteria of nurses treating AIDS patients elsewhere, who were taking extreme precautions in a way the 5B nurses found unnecessary and even homophobic. On the ward, nurses were adamant that we were going to prove to people that it was safe to take care of people with AIDS. There was an element of bravado or even denial in this, and accidental needle sticks, which could transmit the virus, were often downplayed. When a test for antibodies to the virus was developed in 1985, it was a relief for nurses to know for certain if they had been infected. Nurses on 5B tested every few months, which took some anxiety out of the situation. But in 1987, one nurse on the ward who had a needle stick and subsequently seroconverted. Nurses on the ward were stunned. The seroconversion ended up being the catalyst to rectify the excessively cavalier attitude that we had, one recalled. More gloves were worn, and recapping devices were designed to prevent needle sticks. The hardest part of the job, nurses found, was not managing anxiety about their own health, but rather the suffering and loss of patients. The work on 5B was messy nursing. Most of the nurses spoke at length about the nearly constant diarrhea that came with cryptosporidium, a common opportunistic infection. You get a bed changed, all fresh, and 5 minutes later, the patient puts his light on because it was full of diarrhea, as Steve Keith remembered. And sometimes that would happen 5 times before things would settle down and you could breathe. Years later, when treatment involved suppressing viral loads and enhancing immune function such that people lived longer with the illness, AIDS deaths came to look more like cancer, heart failure, and other more standard deaths. Early AIDS deaths were as distinctive as they were brutal. Kaposi's sarcoma was disfiguring and painful. Pneumocystis resulted in oxygen hunger, which was terrifying. One nurse cared for a man who died of Burkitt's lymphoma, a rare disease that before HIV had mostly been seen in Africa. This nurse literally watched her patient's tumors growing during a 12-hour shift. She reached his family, and miraculously, they made it in time to be there with him as he died. After it was over, she walked out of the room and saw another nurse. I fell into him, and I just cried because it was over. Grief was interwoven into every workday. Nurses were all asked about their plan for self-care when they interviewed for the job. But in practice, people found what worked as they went along. Marcy Fraser remembered a kind of silliness and gallows humor on the ward that was sustaining. She worked the night shift, and there was always some quiet time when patients would be asleep and no one needed her. And she and her colleague Charles Cloninger would practice ballroom dancing down the halls because we just couldn't be gloom and doom. For others, regular time away was the most critical for mental health. Kathleen O'Leary had an apartment on Clement Street in the Richmond district. It was a corner unit with a view of the ocean. Her first day off, after several days on, I would just sit on the couch and look out the window. I had no energy for anything else. Another nurse had a habit of taking a book and spending the day at the Osento bathhouse on Valencia Street. Others went out to the Russian River. Not all coping mechanisms were healthy. Drugs, sex, and alcohol, in moderation or to excess, helped to numb the intensity of the work week. Some 5B nurses socialized together a lot outside of work, others not at all. The one collective ritual they shared to process their grief was incredibly simple. They turned a donated scrapbook into what they called a necrology. In it, they wrote the name of every patient they cared for who died of AIDS, the room they died in, and the diagnosis: PCP, KS, cryptosporidium, cryptococcal meningitis. Over time, they began to add small details to better recall the dead as individuals. With brief notes written in haste, the necrology scrapbook grew to encompass pages and pages of names with funny and poignant asides. Great mustache. Square dancer. Served vodka Collins in his room. Hunky and robust till the end. Loving mom by his side. Kimono's wild flamboyance predicted his time. Heartbeat for 1 1/4 hours after he died. Kevin was the sweetest. Exacting patient. Flamenco dancer. Dear sweet Jack. Elderly parents arrived just in time. Received BA on the day he died. Taught us all about dealing with pain. The divine Judy. For most nurses, the job was not sustainable over the long term. They had different breaking points, saw different events as signs that it was time to go. For one nurse, it was a back injury that for her represented a spiritual as well as a physical break, or one too many needle sticks, the loss of a patient they had been especially close to, or the moment when ward nurses themselves began to get sick and die. In the early years alone, one woman nurse died of breast cancer and 2 male nurses died of AIDS. However long they stayed, most of them identified their time on the AIDS ward at San Francisco General as the best job of their working lives. This extremely rich environment, one nurse reflected, posed unavoidable questions. Questions about life and death, and sexuality and discrimination, and drugs and addiction, and family dynamics, and pain and despair, and hope and courage. Meaningful work. Thanks.
Thank you. This was just mesmerizing. I'm so glad I got to hear this. So I have a few questions. I'll keep it really brief. Often historians of race and of racialized labor situate their work as also being directly relevant to the present, right? Or let's say, even borrowing just from my own field, none of this is really history. People are still dying over Confederate monuments in Charlottesville. And I'm wondering what your relationship is to the present, and how that history, is this really history, or are you writing it from a standpoint of here are the questions to which this history still directly speaks, despite whatever has happened in terms of the acceptance of gay life in America. Second question is, what goes on in labor unions? Is that part of your story? This is mostly post, peak labor unionization, but still, is that important? Anything about closeted gay workers? I mean, this is still a time, knowing very little about this, in which some people still get married to a person of the opposite sex, right, and sort of live their life this way. Was this in any way relevant? And just one last point, it's not a question, that the nursing experience is awfully reminiscent, at least in my mind, to Civil War nursing.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of that when I was looking at you. So yes. So the question about the present. I think, my own feeling about that is so different than it would have been a year ago even. And I mean, I remember certainly having the experience during the pandemic, which I think a lot of people had, who were those of us who were fortunate to be able to write during the pandemic, basically because we're not parents, which I'm one of those people. That it was odd that you sort of felt like, how could anything, any history you're telling be important or, relevant, I think. I mean, unless people were, even writing on AIDS, I felt that way. Like, what could possibly be significant? So I had that moment. I think, now there are a couple of ways in which I think it's relevant to the present. I mean, one is just the experience of precarity in work is, I think all around us, and is so much more salient even than it was when I started the project. So I mean, that to me feels very, very palpable. The other, I think, is just, what's going on in the United States with the Don't Say Gay laws and the anti-trans laws, and also, the Dobbs court case that ended Roe v. Wade, and is a threat to bodily autonomy. Those things have all just, I wouldn't have, if you had said to me 5 years ago, I wouldn't have believed that it's possible. And I don't think, with Don't Say Gay and trans, the anti-trans bans, I think that's going to be a flash. I think that those will burn out rather quickly. That's my feeling. I think there's a different story with abortion. But so I guess, I mean, it does feel, I don't know, there's something that feels more about the present than I would have anticipated when I was working on the book. Labor unions, yes, part of the story in this, in a few senses. I mean, one is, to the extent, one of the narrative arcs in the book, or one of, I think, the overall arguments is just about the sort of, really, by the end of the 20th century, I think, the queering of all work, in the sense that, I think if we look at what gay labor was in the 1950s and 1960s, there's a lot about that experience that resembles what work is for everybody, at least in the United States, at the end of the 20th century into our present moment. And I think there's no question that if part of the story of the second half of the 20th century is the queering of all workers in that sense, the decline of labor unions have certainly, I mean, that's certainly part of what has enabled that to happen. So that it's significant in that aspect. Labor itself we talked about this a little bit yesterday, is kind of a complicated story in the sense that unions, going even back to the 1950s and 1960s, would generally protect gay people from being fired, and gay people knew that and counted on it. And it's one of the reasons why in working class jobs, gay people were often more visible than I think we would expect. But in terms of formally protecting people, having, supporting LGBT caucuses, or what would have at that time been gay caucuses, labor has a more mixed record. It was fairly late to support those kinds of movements, and when they did support, the support tended to be kind of anemic, and particularly AFL-CIO. Some unions were more progressive, the teachers union, service workers, but it's a complicated history, I would say. And then our closeted workers part of the story. Yes, I mean, I tried, and this was particularly something with doing the oral histories, is that it was important to me not to just talk to people who would have had a kind of liberationist sensibility or been political or activist. And I had to kind of strategize about that and figure out ways to, I think, make people who would have been reticent at the time and maybe are even still reticent, comfortable talking to me. But I did try to work at that and figure that out, because I think that's an experience that's easily lost, and I think it's an important experience to understand historically.
Thank you so much. I had two questions. First, I'm, as always, utterly convinced, and I'm wondering about two things. One is that you do emphasize the precarity in the talk, in the book, but I was wondering if you do see this, because another, I don't know if it's a trope, but the story told, at least in survey courses, or the general story about the LGBT struggle, is that it's a triumphant story, and in some ways, this is also a little bit of the sense I get from the book. There is this trajectory here, and so I wonder if you see it that way, and in some ways. And second, as I was reading, I all of a sudden, I think it was chapter 4, somewhere in the middle, like the Stonewall came in one time, and this is another thing, right? That people always talk about is this moment, and I guess it's not just Stonewall, but this other part, the part that I completely understand why you don't write about, the nightlife, the other story, but how do those come into contact, like your story and that story?
The Stonewall story.
Yeah, well, the movement through Stonewall and these sorts of gay pride, the marches, Harvey Milk.
So in terms of, is it a triumphant story? I mean, I would say, I think, by the end of the period end of the 20th century, into the 21st, I view it as a bittersweet story. And I would say bittersweet in that I do think it's really, the end of the story is the opening of the workplace for many people, not for everyone. I think it's really important to note that we don't see, I think the sort of vulnerability of working class and poor queer people and trans people and people who live in southern red states, I think we tend to not see that story so much, and they're there and it's important. But I do think, there is definitely an opening that happens, and it's significant and important and moving. But it's also, the opening happens at the same time that jobs in general are deteriorating. And so that's why I think it's hard to be totally triumphant about it for those two reasons. One, because it leaves some people behind, and although I think we don't know at this point what the impact of the 2020 Supreme Court, the Bostock case, will be on whether, to what extent that actually makes a difference for, say, trans people and people in the South, people in more blue-collar kinds of jobs. But that and this, I think the general deterioration of jobs, the decline of standard employment, to me make it like bittersweet. So the Stonewall, I mean, I think I don't fixate on Stonewall. I mean, I think a lot of historians of sexuality are sort of like, Stonewall's a little, like it's kind of mythical and it happened and it's important, but it's one thing. I mean, I think a lot about the kind of work of people like Frank Kameny and who's talked about as a homophile, as really, I think, not so different from the what's happening with liberation and kind of building up to it and connecting to it. And I also think, I do think gay liberation is really important in general for work. And I talk about it in the book, but I want to think about it more as a general ethos than something that happens at a bar in New York. And I think it's important in a few ways. I mean, one is, there is a kind of call to people to reject what has been the earlier arrangement of like, try not to be visible and, just be discreet and you'll probably be okay. And and in exchange, employers are going to exploit you, but that's the way we're going to navigate this. And liberationists say this is unacceptable, and we need to be seen, and we need to be seen at work. And I think that does have an impact on some people who then begin to, I think, basically reject the norms of discretion that have governed behavior in the workplace. It's also, I think, interesting, and one of the things that sort of surprised me in thinking about the liberation period is that actually increases precarity in the workplace for everyone at that point, that then employers in general are agitated and concerned about their gay employees in a way they weren't in the 50s and 60s. And there are a lot of, I heard from a lot of gay people who said, I didn't really want to be part of liberation. This kind of gets to the closeted question, but once there were people coming out in my workplace, there was suspicion directed at me, and that led to adverse conditions in my own employment. So it's a rupture that I think in the end does something very important, but it is actually in interesting ways a difficult moment. And I guess the other thing I would say about the liberationist period that I think is really interesting, that I think enables this change, is there is just kind of broadly in that moment a kind of countercultural skepticism about work and career. Everyone is downwardly mobile in the 70s, and so I think that's something that is in the broader culture that makes gay people who in the 50s and 60s were clinging to their tenuous positions say, why do we need this? Let's, who cares about career? Let's find ourselves and be authentic and all of that. So I mean, it's definitely in sync with that broader 70s moment, which is so interesting.
Thank you. Question, Amy?
Thank you very much. And I have a bit of a more methodological question about your use of oral history. Mm-hmm. So if you could tell a little bit about how you approach that, questions of memory even, and did you try to just take stories as they were, or was there a process of trying to kind of compare between written sources and oral sources, and just generally about how did you find people and everything?
Mm-hmm. So I started with oral histories, as I said, because I wasn't sure that I would find things in the archive. as soon as I started talking to people, I thought, oh, this is wrong. There's going to be stuff in the archive, and there was. And then I did try and read the oral history sources against the archival record, kind of back and forth. And I think, the oral history sources both helped me think about where to look and the argument. And I did a lot of them, I think, because partly they were just, fascinating and really meaningful, and I really loved doing them, and I could have done them much longer. But also because I wanted to get to the sort of something in the aggregate and to be able to think about patterns, and I knew that involved talking to a lot of people. In terms of how I found people, I think, it was not particularly systematic, and I think a true social scientist would, be appalled at probably how I went about it. But I started, the first year I was really working on this project was 2010, 2011, and I was on fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard. And I surmised, based on reading that I had been doing, that the people who would be most difficult to get to talk to me and would have been most closeted at mid-century were people in elite occupations. So I took advantage of being there that year. Harvard has a huge gay alumni network, and they let me use their network to find their older members, and I had a really good response from that group. And then at the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, there's a social service agency that's in New York and various other American cities called Services and Advocates to Gay Elders. And they have a $2 drop-in dinner in Midtown, and they were very nice about letting me go to the dinner and tell people about my work and ask them if they'd be willing to talk to me. And again, to get to the question about sort of closetedness, kind of here and throughout, I kind of developed a sensibility over time that the less people wanted to talk to me, the more I wanted to talk to them. So it was, one of those sort of dating things where I was kind of pursuing people who weren't really interested and pushing people away who were coming after me too much. And then there was, kind of snowball sampling. So, I'd learn of one person and then kind of go through their network. So I did a wonderful set of interviews with gay and lesbian auto workers in Detroit and Lansing, and blue-collar lesbians in Houston, and lesbian deans of social work who vacation on Cape Cod. There were just all these great little pockets. Most interviews I did in person because of the age of people I was talking to, because of what we were talking about. The query that I put out, and again, this gets back to Yael's question, it was specifically about work, which I think was, is a little bit safer than if I'd said, I want to talk to people about your sexual behavior or your dating life, or so it's specifically about work. And I also made anonymity a default condition of the study, so that would be something that made people who might otherwise be uncomfortable. And that was a complicated decision, and is a complicated decision, because of course it means recloseting people who might not want to be recloseted. And I guess the other thing I would say about the oral histories is that I did most of them probably in the first 3 years that I was doing research. And then as I got into the archival stuff, I'd come across, someone who did something important in the study, and then I would, kind of find those people, and I kind of kept going all the way to the end, and I was doing them much less frequently at the end, but I kind of felt like, I don't know, they really kept me connected to the heart of the project, and I really valued, like, just kind of continually dropping in I did the very last interview I did was in, I think, 2021, after I had a full draft of the manuscript. And that interview, I talk in the chapter on AIDS about the development of these very low to the ground, openly gay and lesbian legal practices, solo practitioners that develop in the 70s and the 80s. Many of them connected to lesbian feminism, and then they're sort of there to triage the legal needs that come out of the AIDS epidemic. And so the very last interview I did was actually with the lawyer who had done my will in Washington, D.C. His name is Michelle Zavos, and she's one of these folks who had a law practice in Washington since the late 70s. And so it was just super fun to go to her house and sit on her porch and have her tell me about her career as a lawyer. So they were really important, and I loved doing them.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes. Short question, short answer. No? Anyone else? Please keep it short. Please keep it short, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you very much for the very inspiring lecture. I noticed, if I'm not wrong, that you never used the idiom male gay or female gay, talking only about gay workers. And I wonder if it was a kind of a strategy, there was intention behind it, thinking that there must be important differences in the labor market and the images of gay and lesbians among employers. Anti-sodomy was relevant for gay people, for male gay people. And continuing this line of thinking, anti-sodomy law were cancelled, I think, first in Illinois in 1962, gradually in other states, and only in 2003 they were abolished in the federally. So the question if anti-sodomy law was relevant to the relationships between employers and employees.
Mm-hmm. Great questions. I mean, so first of all, one aspect of this is just the question of language, which I think is always, it's so stymieing in this field. So I do in the book talk about gay and lesbian both, and somewhat queer and trans. And I try to use words that were used at the time. Queer is complicated. I think it's a good word in that it gets at gender transgression and is inclusive of trans people in a way that gay isn't. But it's also a word that, I think for the people I was interviewing for that age cohort, for many people it's a painful word. And so there isn't a kind of a perfect way to navigate that. In terms of what you're asking about the differences between male and female workers, that's something that I do attend to in the book quite a lot. And I mean, I guess I would say in general, I think the experience for gay men and lesbians is similar. I think there's a similar dynamic that encapsulates both experiences. Where I think there's a difference is I think women's economic vulnerability is always greater. And that's true whether we're talking about blue collar women who were trading, who were basically, trading a good wage for visibility in their jobs, women who were wearing men's clothes to work in assembly lines, perhaps having pictures of their girlfriends on their workbench, even in the 1950s and 60s. Employers were happy with that because they were paying these women's wages to do men's jobs. And so that was that kind of relationship. For professional women, pretty high level of discretion at work, trying to kind of signal to employers that they were career women who were not going to get married and leave their jobs, which made them attractive, but not doing anything that would challenge norms of respectability. And it's interesting that, I think for professional people, one of the things I noticed throughout was that women had to be even more careful than men in terms of being discreet at work. And I think that has everything to do with economic vulnerability, that that women were just more vulnerable in terms of their employment and in terms of their wages, which is interesting because it, I think, kind of goes against a notion that we often have, I think, when we talk about gay men and women, that gay men had it worse. That's, I think, a trope we hear. And I think that's probably true in terms of violence, harassment on the street. But anytime we're talking about economics and wages, it's not. And so in that way, I think there is a difference, that the economic vulnerability was, even though I think the basic dynamic is the same, the economic vulnerability was greater for women.
Thank you very much.